So at the end of this week's Parasha Shelach, we have one of the most important mitzvahs in the Torah. And how could one judge and say one of the most important mitzvahs? Because it's not me saying that, but in Shavuos Daf Chavtes, the Gemara says, Shkula mitzvahs tzitzis keneged kol ha-mitzvahs shebetoira. And there are only a handful of mitzvahs about which Chazal say. So if I would ask you, what's a greater mitzvah, tzitzis or tefillin? What do you think? Which is a greater mitzvah, tzitzis or tefillin? So in Simach Hey, in the first sif, the Shulchan Aruch says, first you put on your talis and then tefillin. Why does talis come before tefillin? The Beis Yosef explains for two reasons. So by mitzvahs there is a seder kedima, precedence, not precedence, but rather priorities. Which comes first, which comes second. And there are two fundamental halachas. Todir v'she'enoi todir koidem. A mitzvah which is more constant has precedence, and a mitzvah that is mekudash. The greater mitzvah comes first. The lesser mitzvah comes second. And the Beis Yosef says, tzitzis is both todir and mekudash. It's todir because Shabbos and Yom Tov you don't have a mitzvah of tefillin, but mitzvah tzitzis is relevant every day of the year. And it's also mekudash because shkula mitzvah tzitzis keneged kol ha-mitzvah shebetoira. So one of the Choshev Bochum said that tefillin has more kedusha, and it definitely does. Because tefillin is defined as tashmisha kedusha, and tzitzis are just tashmisha mitzvah. You could go into the bathroom with tzitzis, but not with tefillin. That is regarding the cheftzah. The cheftzah of tefillin definitely has a higher level of kedusha than tzitzis, but in dinei kedima, it doesn't depend on kedushas a cheftzah, but rather which is a greater mitzvah. And tzitzis comes before tefillin. So I'm always troubled by the fact that people today are extremely makbid and hidur of tefillin, and they spend thousands of dollars to have the best sofer to write the parshiyos and the best bati macher, and there are so many chumras al gabe chumras, but people aren't that makbid about mitzvah tzitzis. Most people don't even have niputz lishma, even though according to many poskim you need niputz lishma. And the Pele Yoyetz complains that people have beautiful suits and beautiful hats and beautiful shoes, not only their suits and their hats, and dirty, filthy talesim. And he says, this is strange. If you're so fastidious and particular about your dress, what about your most important and beautiful garment? And that is your tzitzis. So when I first became a Rav, and I was seeing people without my jacket, just with my talis cotton, my Geboim said, sepasnish. Do you know what that means, sepasnish? Yeah? Sepasnish. It's not appropriate. The Rav needs to wear a black suit. And I said, black suits, some of our distant cousins also have long black garments. It's not unique just to us. And sometimes in Yerushalayim you could see them out in the streets wearing these long black robes. But nobody has anything remotely like this. This is the most beautiful, the most Jewish beged. This is what we should be proud of. That's the most beautiful beged. So what's wrong with seeing people in my talis cotton? So the Pele Yoyetz complains, why do you wear such a filthy talis if you have such a beautiful suit? So some of my talesim are already yellow. But maybe yellow is a nice color, not less than white. But they're always clean. It's hard to part from a talis you've been davening with many years and a talis that absorbed some of your tears when you were moved while davening. So it takes a while since I could take a beloved talis and put it into Gniza, but I'm always makpid that my tzitzis and my talis should be clean. So tzitzis is a greater mitzvah than tefillin, as we see in Simach Chof Hey. And we should care about this mitzvah, and we should care about our tzitzis. So every day in the morning before you say a bracha on your tzitzis, first source on our seat, Simen Chesif Tes, Koidem Shiyavorach. Yem bechutei tzitzis, imem ksheirem, kedei shelo yavorech levatola. We don't want to say bracha levatola, and therefore, before you put on your talis every day in the morning, you need to check your tzitzis. If you're a married person, you don't say a bracha on your talis cotton. You just say a bracha when you wear your talis godel, and you have in mind to pater the talis cotton. If you don't have a talis godel, you say a bracha on your talis cotton, and before saying the bracha, you need to check the tzitzis to see that they are kosher. The source of this halacha is the Rosh. We skip source number 2, we'll get back to it. Source number 3. והחורד אל דבר השם יבדק ציצס קודם עטיפה כדי שלא יברך ברכה לבטלה. And the Tur quotes the Rosh, and the Shulchan Aruch follows the footsteps of the Tur. However, I do want you to realize that the wording seems to be somewhat different. In the Rosh, it seems to be clear that this is not me'ikar adin, but rather a chumrah. And that is why the Rosh says, hachored al dvar Hashem. This is not a halacha. Hachored el dvar Hashem yivdik tzitzis koidem atifa, which means that is the meaning of real yirei shamayim. Shulchan Aruch says, koidem shiyavorach yayem bechitei tzitzis emeksheirim, and that seems to be a halacha. And the Rosh seems to contradict his own ruling. Tshuvas HaRosh, source number 4. מה שכוספתו שאין לצייס בטלס מצויצס לשוס הרבים דילמה אין מצויצס כלחוסה. אמס הוא שרואיסי לקצת רבותיי שהיו נוהגים כן, שהיו פוישתם טלס שלהם כשהיו יועצם לשוס הרבים. ואני אומר שחומר שאין לו טעם היא. דלמה יקלה מחש. This is a fascinating Rosh. Obviously, this was not a minig of Ame Arotzois. He writes, Ra'iti lektzat rabotai, some of my teachers, and nevertheless he says it's a chumra she'ein bo ta'am. Doesn't make sense. So the Rosh was up to saying, yes, I saw some great people do this, but in my opinion it doesn't make sense. Do you know that the briskers don't go out to Shus Rabim with a talis kort nor a talis godel? Their minig is like Tzat Rabotav Shel HaRosh. And the Rosh says, strange. The Ichai Sheshem Nifsiku Achutin Velo Nishar Kedei Hechshet Tzitzis Em Ken Hayech Berecholo B'Shor Shel Avshoy. Why are you afraid just when you go out to the Shus Rabim? How did you make a bracha in the morning? Ki Oynish Godel Ulevarech Bracha Levatola. ואם תומש שבודה כל דלת ציצס בשעס לוי, שאם כן יבדה גם בשעס יוצא של הרבים. מה נפשך? You put on your talis in the morning, and you didn't check? Weren't you afraid of a brocha levatola? And if you check in the morning, check again. What's your problem? If you check and you see that tzitzis are kosher, what is your problem? And therefore, the Rosh writes, Hu olam loi nahagu ken livdoi kol hatzitzias b'kol shu shemesata b'telisoy mishum do makminelo b'cheskas kashrus. There's a cheskas kashrus. You checked yesterday. You checked the deck before yesterday. When you were kosher, the tzitzis, they were kosher. So there's a chazakah. So you don't need to check when you go out to Shus Rabim, and you don't need to check in the morning. Is this a contradiction? What do you say? Is there a stira between the two Rosh, the one in the Chuvas and the one in Hilchas Tzitzis in the Psokim? Why not?
One is saying that the highest level people check in. The other is saying that it makes no sense. But
what's your name? What do you learn? So Eitan says, it's not a stira. Because the Rosh in the Psukim clearly says, "Hachored el dvar Hashem." This is not a halacha, and the minhag oilam is not to be makbid. But the Bishaysev does seem to say it's a stira. Source number 5. V'yafar b'shekosa b'tshuva klal beis. Semetet she'oilam lo yinahag olivdo kol hatzitzios b'chol shu shemesatev mishim dov gmila b'cheskes kashas kosev rabbeinu kidvorov b'psukim shechored el dvar Hashem yesh lo livdok. So the Bishaysev says that the Bishaysev preferred what the Rosh writes in the Psukim and not what he writes in the Tshuvas. Bach understood the Bishaysev as if there is a stira, contradiction. However, the Bach says, no, it's not this piece of the Bach, but the Bach says there is no stira because the Rosh clearly says it's an extreme chumrah, and it is what Achored el Dvar Hashem does, so this wouldn't be considered a contradiction at all. However, the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, source number 6, Ya'ayen hatzitzis koidem lechen shiu shleimem she'em neskal kalechon mem have a brocha levetol. Coming back to source number 1, the Shulchan Aruch, koidem she'avorach ya'ayen b'chut hatzitzis. The Tur and the Shulchan Aruch seem to indicate that this is a din, that this is a halacha, and not only a chumre yesera of hachored el devar Hashem. What is the reasoning behind this halacha or this minhag? Why does one need to check? And why don't we rely on a chazaka like the Rosh says in his tshuva? Psochim davdala domedalef. Source number 2. Boy menay mer Menachem b'Yisroel kamaske bais lechavele barbos chesvos yoda kohen chesvos bodok. Person rented a home Erev Pesach, and he's moving into that rental Erev Pesach till after Pesach. Does he need to do b'dikas chometz, or would he assume that probably the Baal HaBayis, the owner, was makayim his mitzvah or l'arba osar, and he was b'dikas chometz yesterday night? The Gemara asks, Lamay nafkamina, lishayle. Why didn't you ask him? The leisei lahai de lishiyulei. He's not home. We can't ask him. He's not around. We need to look for him. La truche lahai mai. So the Rishonim proved from this Gemara, if you could ask, you can't rely on a chazaka. Because the question was, is there cheskosei bodek or there is no chazaka? And the Gemara says, why didn't you ask? So obviously, if you could ask, you don't rely on chazaka. So the Magen Avraham says, if you could check your tzitzis, you don't rely on chazaka. Kol she'efshar levarer, you don't rely on chazaka. And that is the interpretation, the pshat of the Magen Avraham. So the Magen Avraham, source number 8. Harosh kosev de nagu shelo labot kei da oike acheskosai u elu shachored al dvar Hashem yesh lo nivdik. Babach kosev de lo oike mecheskosai kivin she'en achazoka beteva. But the Magen Avraham says, the reason we are boidik, it's the 4th line. Nerali. The mekal mokom chayev labot mishum de ein samchem al achazoka b'mokom she'echolim levarer kama shekosev beyoredeya Siman Aleph. Why does he quote Yoredeya Siman Aleph and he doesn't quote the Gemara and Pesachim? What's the story of Yoredeya Siman Aleph? And that is actually the very first seif in Yoredeya, Siman Aleph, Seif Aleph. The Gemara says in Masechet Chulin, Rav Mitzuya Neitzel Shchita Mumchem Heim. Most of the people that are involved in shchita are authorized, are up to the job. And therefore, if somebody shechted a behema and you don't know who the shechet was, you could assume that it's a shchita ksheira, because most of the people doing shchita are reliable. However, Shulchan Aruch says, if the shechet is still around, then you need to check him out. You need to say, show me your smicha. You put them into a brief discussion. And how do we know that? From the Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara says, if the Balabais is around, ask him whether he did B'dikas Chumash or not. B'mokim she'ef shel avarer, we don't rely on a chazaka. B'mokim she'ef shel avarer, we don't rely on roiv. And even though Rav Mitzuyan Eitz Shchita Mumchem Heim, if you could be Mavarer, you need to do so. Who says it's different? But we are Boidik Dereya because it's a tercha. Efsher Levarer is only Efsher Levarer Bekal. Oh, it's a huge tercha, right? I think it takes anywhere between 1 second and 2 seconds to check your tzitzis. To cut open a behemoth and remove its organs and check the organs is a huge tercha. It's a huge tercha. And that makes all the difference. So there's a sefer called Shalosh Teshuvos Shivas Tzion. I would be very surprised if anybody here knows about this Shivas Tzion. Maybe the Ramim know about this Shivas Tzion. He was the son of the Noid of Yehuda, Reb Shmuel Lando, who took his position. Shivas Tzion Siman Lamed deals with our question, and he says, Boidik Zayin your tzitzis is a tercha. It's not a tercha. But doing it every day in the morning would be considered a tercha. And that's why you don't need to. I don't think so, because checking your tzitzis is far less tercha than cross-examining the person that rented you his house or checking out a shaychet. I think looking over your tzitzis, if you're really slow and lazy, would take you 3 seconds. Most people, it'll take 1 second to 2 seconds, and that's not a tercha at all, and therefore, the Mogen Avraham says, that is the reason we need to check our tzitzis every morning. There is a chazaka, but you don't rely on chazaka, b'mokam she'efshar levarer. So that is the pshat of the Mogen Avraham. Comes along the Taz, source number 11, Turei Zahav. כדי שלא יברך ברכה לבטלה, ויאף על גב דבלאו וכי יש שיר בדלת כנפס בלא ציצס. If you put on a talis and your tzitzis are posel, you have another problem. Not only bracha levatola, it's an aveda to wear dalet kanfas without tzitzis. It's a bitul mitzvah asay diuraisa. V'yafragav de balavo chi yesh shashiyel bish dalet kanfas below tzitzis makol makom oikalei cheskosoi shoye kosher rak mishum chumre doloi tisu v'chmiru dafke lebod koi. V'ayla kaman yud gimel aleph. What do we have in Yud Gimel Aleph? Brings us back to source number 9. And that is Siv Beis in Siman Yud Gimel. The Shulchan Aruch writes, if you go out to Rishus HaRabim with a posel tzitzis, then you're chayiv chatas, because that is a masa and not a beged. And then Amur writes, Moikmina letalas acheskosoi shu mitzuyas kel chosoi ve'ein tzorich lebod kei koidim sheyetzemoi. Does this psak sound familiar? That is the Tshuvas Harash. We have it the other side of our page. Meikar adin, you don't need to check your tzitzis when you go out to the Rishus HaRabim, because there's a chazaka. So the Taz says, it is only mishum chumre de brocha levatola. And that is why both the Rosh and the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch says, check your tzitzis, shouldn't be a brocha levatola. We're not afraid of Rishus HaRabim. We're not afraid of Dalet Kanfus without tzitzis, because there's a chazaka. It is only mishum chumras brocha levatola. And I have a huge problem with this Taz. There's a machlokes whether brocha levatola is an issa diuraisa or an issa derabanan. And the Mogen Avraham brings both opinions in Siman Reish Tes Vav. The Rosh, and I stress the Rosh, Perek Hamed Kedushin Siman Mem Tes, quotes Rabbeinu Tam, Brocha v'Torah is an Issa d'Rabbanan. And when the Gemara says in Brochas Lamed Gimel, Lo yisisu Hashem Elokecho l'shav, and that is Brocha v'Torah, that's an asmachta. But the Issa of Brocha v'Torah is midrabanan. Wearing dalet kanfus without tzitzis is an Issa d'Uraisa. Masa b'rshus harabim is an Issa d'Uraisa. So what's the chumrah of Brocha v'Torah? The Rama says you don't need to check your tzitzis when you go out l'shus harabim. And you don't need to check your tzitzis mechashash. If the tzitzis are puzzled, then I'm wearing dalet kanfus without tzitzis. It's only the chumrah of a Brocha v'Torah. But according to the Rosh, quoting Rabbeinu Tam, Brocha v'Torah is an Issa d'Rabbanan. Dalet kanfus without tzitzis is the Uraisa. Moitzi Maser Shus Harabim is the Uraisa. So it depends on Machlokes Shulchan Aruch and Amor whether we have it as Shus Harabim the Uraisa or not. But it's a Issa Chama. And according to the Rosh, Brocha v'Torah is only midrabanan. So I'm going to say a huge chiddush now. And I know it's huge, and probably most of them won't agree with me, but I think it's emes. Because we're not dealing with Ikar Hadin, only with the Chumrah HaChoreid El Devar Hashem, we rely on a Chazakah. And a Chazakah is a Din Torah. And we rely on Chazakahs when it's a Chashash of Koros and Mises Beis Din. Chazakah is a Din Gomo. We rely on a Chazakah de Mikora. It is only a Chumri Asera, HaChoreid Al Devar Hashem. Brocha v'Torah is Hashem HaGodol v'Hanoiro. It's an Issa d'Rabbanan. But in the Darga of Yiras Shamayim, it comes before Moitzi Masal Rishus Harab, Dalet Kanfus without tzitzis. Because we rely on Chazukas. And Chazukas is Min HaTorah. We learn Chazukah on every area of halacha. So Brocha v'Torah might only be an Issa d'Rabbanan. But for Achored al Dvar Hashem, in the Madreges of Yiras Shamayim, Brocha v'Torah might come before other dinim, even though they're Min HaTorah. So there are two sources in Shas, Moitzi Shem Shamayim Levatollah. In Masechet Muri, the Gemara says, Eis Hashem Elokecho Tiro. Masechet Brochas, the Gemara says, Lo yisisu Hashem Elokecho l'shav. Eis Hashem Elokecho Tiro. Doesn't that fit in with HaChoreid El Devar Hashem? So, in the Madreges of Charoda Al Devar Hashem and Yiras Shamayim, Brocha v'Torah is paramount. And it is more than Dinam D'Oraisa, because we rely on Chazakah. Kach le'biyoymali. So that is the Turei Zohar. But the Magen Avraham says it's not only about Brocha v'Torah. You don't rely on this Chazakah because of Shalavarar. Like Yoredei Siman Aleph, like Orachaim Tov Lamed Zayin, like Bedikas Chometz, and like Shchita. So what does it have to do with Brocha v'Torah? According to the Magen Avraham, we need to explain the Lashon of the Rosh to Shulchan Aruch. You need to check your tzitzis for many reasons, because we don't rely on Chazakah. And therefore, you might be wearing dalet kanfus without tzitzis. But when to check your tzitzis? Preferably in the morning before you say the brocha. It shouldn't be a brocha v'Torah. It's not all about brocha v'Torah. And the Magen Avraham actually gives another explanation as well. בוודאי אי אפשר לעולם לא יקמה אחז כוסוי כיוון דעשוי להיפוסק. The Magen Avraham says, how long will you rely on the chazukah? Forever? Forever? So you bought a new tzitzis 10 years ago. 10 years transpired. You still rely on the chazukah? We know that sooner or later, your tzitzis will get torn. It happens always. So, how long will you rely on this chazukah? So sometimes down the road, you need to be boidek. But Chazal didn't say when. And therefore the minhag is, do it every day in the morning. You cannot rely on this chazukah forever because we know that it is inevitable. Anybody that has tzitzis knows that after the tzitzis goes through the washer and the dryer 100 times, and so many different reasons. And therefore the minhag is to do it every day in the morning. So according to the Magen Avraham, it's not only about bracha levatala, but if you need to check in the morning before you put on your tzitzis, because then you won't say a bracha levatala. But it is not only about bracha levatala. So according to the Magen Avraham, why don't you need to check before you go out to the Rishus Harabim? Because you checked in the morning. And if you checked an hour ago, 2 hours ago, 3 hours ago, you don't need to check again. Because anyway, you checked every day in the morning, and that's the pshat of the Magen Avraham. Going back to the Chumrah, the briske Chumrah. And as we see, it's not only a briske Chumrah, some of the Rabbeim of the Rosh were makbid not to go out to Rishus Harabim with tzitzis. And the Rosh asks a very fundamental question. So why don't you be boidik in the morning before you put on your talis and you're not afraid of bracha v'torah? And if you are boidik in the morning, you can do the same when you leave to the Rishus Harabim. So what's your problem? I think there might be a very simple answer. When you go out to the Rishus Harabim, every day is different, every person is different. How long will you be outside, and where exactly are you going, and what exactly will you be engaged in? So you might go out for 5 minutes, you might go in the morning and come home by night. You might take a walk in the park. You might rub against trees and against rocks. And when you go out to Rishus Harabim, you need to take into consideration you're going to be out there for 10 hours or for 5 hours. You're going to engage in who knows what type of activities. Your tzitzis might go torn in the middle of the way and you won't realize. And then you know some masa Rishus Harabim. When you put on your talis in the morning just before davening, and you're going to take it off in 45 minutes when you finish davening, and you're standing and you're standing and you're kaveh mokom litfilo, maybe you don't have to be that concerned that your tzitzis might be puzzled. You davened yesterday, you put it into the bag, you're taking it out this morning. So maybe there is a mokom liyashiv, the minhag, before you go out Rishus Harabim, check your tzitzis. Because where are you going? For how long are you going? What are we going to be engaged in? And your tzitzis might get torn and you won't realize it. And if you do realize it, what are you going to do? You don't want to leave your talis and Rishus Harabim hanging on a tree. You can't hang it on a tree because osalesh tamish be'ilonis. And so maybe there is some sense in the minhag, check your tzitzis before you go out Rishus Harabim or after you come back from Rishus Harabim. So anyway, so this is a huge discussion about the minhag is to check your tzitzis every day in the morning before saying the brocha, kedei shelo yavorach brocha levatoleh. So at the beginning of today's shiur, I explained that mitzvah tzitzis is greater than mitzvah tefillin. And then one might ask, so why is tefillin a chiyuv and tzitzis is not? Tefillin is a chiyuv. And if you skip the day, you have an aveda. But a person could go through all his life without wearing tzitzis, and he doesn't have an aveda. If you don't have dalet k'anfis, you're not mechuyev in tzitzis, and why is that? Libi yoimari. I heard a story 40 years ago from the Lev Simcha. He was the Gerer Rebbe. And the Lev Simcha said he heard this story from his great father, the Imre Emes. So the Imre Emes said that his great father, the Sfas Emes, maybe some of you never heard of the Lev Simcha. Some of you might have not heard about the Imre Emes, but everybody heard of the Sfas Emes. It is one of the most popular tzidis for him. Everybody learns Sfas Emes. So it transpired that the Sfas Emes once said, Unu Hashem de when you say Onu Hashem, you could do the greatest things and achieve the greatest heights. And the Imre Emes said there was an argument between Ziknei HaChasidim. Did the Rebbe mean Onu Hashem Oshiono or Onu Hashem Atzlichono? And the Imre Emes said, I understood that he meant neither Onu Hashem Oshiono nor Onu Hashem Atzlichono. What he had in mind was Onu Hashem ki ani avdecho. That's the story. And now I'll give you my pshat in the story. So what's so great about Onu Hashem ki ani avdecho? Does anybody know who was the greatest daktakan, the greatest grammarist of all the Rishonim? Who was he? The Radak, Reb David Kimchi. And he explains that honor with an aleph is a plea. Honor with a hey is an expression of gratitude. Honor Hashem, Oishiyano, honor Hashem, Etzlichano is crying out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and pleading, please, please HaKadosh Baruch Hu, help us, salvage us. Honor with a hey is thank you. Honor Hashem, thank you Hashem, ki ani avdech. Only twice in the entire Mishnah Torah LaHarambam do we find the expression Simcha Yisero. Only twice in the entire Rambam. Simcha Yisero is Simcha to the extreme, excessive Simcha. At the end of Hilchas Lulav, Afal Pisha Kol HaMoyed Mitzvah L'Smoyach Ben B'Yamei HaChag Ois Hashem Simcha Yisero. Every Yom Tov we have the Mitzvah L'Samachta B'Chakecho. But the greatest Simcha was Sukkos. Where else do we find Simcha Yisera? Perek Gimel of Hilchas Chanukah. Ein oimerem hal b'Rosh v'Yom Kippurim, lefi she'ein elu yomim shel Simcha Yisera, elu yomim shel yiro v'fachad. Halal is Simcha Yisera, Sukkos is Simcha Yisera. Shteit Ayid, a Jew stands there. Kiflayim Simcha Yisera, Halal and Sukkos. And he says, thank you, Hashem. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks, what is it about? Why are you saying thank you? And he says, Ki ani avdecha. Thank you for letting me serve. Thank you for having me as a slave. And that is Avdus Metoich Simcha. And that tops everything else. Last week, Shabbos, Parshas Bahaloischa, we learned the story of Miriam that had Sarat, and they spoke negatively about Moshe Rabbeinu. And then the Pasuk says, Pisoim. Pisoim means suddenly. Pisoim is something that cannot wait. It is urgent. HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears Pisoim. And he says, Madua lo yeresem ledaber ba'avdi b'Moshe. Aren't you afraid? How do you dare to talk negatively about Avdi Moshe? Lo kein Avdi Moshe pe'er pe'adaber imoi. Why does the HaKadosh Baruch Hu call Moshe Rabbeinu an Eved and not a Ben? Does anybody the Gemara remember the Gemara? When are we called Avodim and when are we called Bonim? When? Who says that? It's a Machlokes Samei and Chachamim. But the Chachamim say, "B'zman she'oisem l'tzayin shemokam kuyin bonim, ein oisem l'tzayin shemokam kuyin avodim." So why is Moshe called an Eved? No one did l'tzayin shel mokom more than Moshe Rabbeinu. The answer is in the Tfilas Shabbos Shachars. Yismach Moshe b'matnas chelkoi ki Eved nemon korosaloi. Avdus metoich simcha. When we choose Avdus out of love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's a greater madrega than being a ben. Nobody is a son out of choice. Nobody could choose his father or mother. Your father and mother made that choice for you. But when a person chooses Avdus ma'ahava or mesimcha, that's far greater than being a Bain. Because then you connect to Mamed Har Sinai. It is the first time in history and the last time in history that an entire people cried out, Nasa v'nishma. An entire people said, thank you Hashem, ki ani avdecha. And this is what we want, this is what we choose, this is what we love. Ki ani avdecha. And that is the highest madrega. So what is the difference between tefillin and tzitzis? Tefillin is royalty. Pa'echo chovosh olecho. An ovel the first day doesn't put on tefillin. pe'er tachas eifer. Tefillin is majesty. Tefillin is royalty. HaKadosh Baruch Hu imposes royalty on us. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you are b'nei malachim. And never forget that. And act in accordance. So tefillin is a chiyuv. Tzitzis is defined in Menachos Mem Gimel Amud Beis, chosim sheltit. And Toysus on the spot says, what is a chosim sheltit? That is the symbol of avdus. In days of yore, a slave had a patch on his garment which cried out, I am a slave. And Toysus explains that's tzitzis, chosim shel avdus. Malchus HaKadosh Baruch Hu imposes on us. Avdus HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I don't want to force you into submission. I hope you will choose avdus, like Moshe Rabbeinu, like your forefathers did 3,000 years ago when they were makdim nasa lenishma. And that is why tefillin is a chiyuv, tzitzis is not. Because tzitzis is about servitude, it is about avdus. And Yiddish avdus is avdus metoich simcha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu prefers that we choose avdus, and he doesn't want to impose avdus upon us. And that is the simcha that every Yid needs to feel every moment of his life. So the Sifra Nusa talk a lot about simchas HaTorah and simchas HaMitzvah. But there is a simcha that is even more fundamental than simchas HaTorah and simchas HaMitzvah, and that is simchas HaAvdus. Just thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we are who we are, and we are His chosen people. Asher bocher bono mekol ha'amim v'nosen lano es teirasoi. And that is, Ono Hashem ki ani avdecha, ani avdecha ben amesecha. Pitachtu l'moiseirai. You let me free, and I didn't run away. Pitachtu l'moiseirai. But I am going nowhere. This is where I want to be. And it's no wonder that the Sfasema said, Sukkos by Hallel, double Simchi Yasera, and you say, Oh no Hashem, thank you Hashem, for what? For letting me serve, for having me as a servant, Ki ani avdecha. You could reach the greatest heights, and that is the Simcha of Avdus. We should have that feeling every moment of our lives. Ono Hashem, Ki ani avdecha, ani avdecha ben amesecha. Have a beautiful Shabbos.